is Pamela Oliver. I teach Spanish here at Richmond Community College. And I'm sitting down with Andrew Prieto, who teaches art here at the college, and we're going to talk about Hispanic Heritage Month and its significance. Hispanic Heritage Month was an initiative originally put on by President Lyndon B. Johnson. It was first 1 week, and then President Ronald Reagan expanded it to an entire month. And it takes place from September 15th to October 15th. And the reason it takes place during those dates is because many countries in Latin America earned their independence in between those dates. And one of the countries that earned its independence within that time period was Mexico, celebrates its Independence Day on September 16th. So today I'm going to be talking to Mr. Prieto about his Cuban American heritage and what Hispanic Heritage Month means to him. So Andrew, of what nationality are both of your parents?
So my
nationalities.
My father was born and raised in Havana, Cuba, and my mother was of Scotch-Irish descent on her father's side and of Cajun French descent on her mother's side. So my grandparents on my mother's side actually met in Louisiana, where my grandfather was a professor at LSU. And they met. But my father came over right as Batista was sort of being pushed out of the Cuban government and Castro was sort of taking power. And my grandfather sort of saw, I think, what was coming and decided to send all of his children to private schools in America. So he contacted the U.S. Embassy, had a list of schools, and my father ended up at Belmont Abbey, which is a Catholic boys' school in North Carolina. So that's why I'm here.
And roughly how old was your father when he came to the United States?
12. And spoke no English. Very, very little. Of course, they had English class in school, but he, I think was not exactly proficient. And so that was, I think, a big hurdle for him. And how he took up the task of learning the language was through writing poetry, which is something that he did up until his death. 83.
And did he ever tell you about any culture clash or issues assimilating that he experienced when he came over at the age of 12?
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of that, but it seems much different than what we sort of face today. A lot less caustic, I think. I think it was just like, could be looked at like as like schoolyard ribbing back then. It wasn't necessarily like being completely terrorized because of your nationality. And you also have to know that that school hosted many, many Cuban children. So he was also around other Cuban boys and girls. The sister college was St. Mary's. And so they, or actually grade school. And so, yeah, I think it was an issue. It did feel markedly different. But I think it was much less difficult because, the process that he went through was very supportive in those days, I think. And he always talked about that. So, other than the fact that Catholic school can be difficult.
Sure. When your father was raising you, which languages were spoken in your household?
Primarily English, but I did grow up around Spanish because anytime my Cuban family would come to visit, and this was several times a year, a switch would turn. And the household would become a completely different environment, one that even felt foreign to me. And so it was interesting because it seemed like this transformation of just even my father into this entirely different person. So both, but I would say heavily on the English. And that had to do with my father's politics, my father's sort of belief system, much more than the practical side of it. Because for him coming to America and going through like naturalization and becoming a citizen was sort of this major event and one that he took very, very seriously. And sort of, I don't know if you didn't know this about old Cubans, but they sort of like severed themselves from where they're from in a way because it's too painful. And so it became this kind of poeticized fantasy land of some kind of distant, buried past, you know? And when they talk about it, it's in this way, very poeticized way.
And your father's insistence on speaking English in the household and not speaking Spanish with you, do you think that was his way of having his own anti-Castro movement?
I do. Yeah, I think yes. And so my father, there was an interesting thing about my father when he first came over, is that he was already sort of politicized, right? Even as a 12-year-old boy. Because, you know, my grandfather, you know, his reason for sending him to school in the United States was political. And so this never left him. It was a major part of the fabric of his persona. And in fact, when he married my mother, he was 15 and my mother was 13. My mother left school to go to Cuba, right, to get married. And my grandparents forbade it, but they disobeyed and took off to Cuba. And, you know, this is unheard of at the time. This little country girl from, like, York, South Carolina, you know, going to this exotic place, you know. And so while they're there, my mother learned Spanish in less than 6 months. And I mean proficient Spanish that stayed with her until she died a year ago. And spoke it all the time. And so she was more interested in the way. And maybe that's some of this sort of like Anglo exoticizing of you know, kind of Latin culture or something. But she always made it present in the home. And all of the foods that she learned to cook there, she kept as staples in the household. So she sort of like had more of a hand in keeping that alive than my father did in a way, which is just kind of weird.
And how long did your parents stay in Cuba?
They stayed there for 4 years, 5 years. My first sibling was born there. First language was Spanish, and now she remembers none of it. So when they moved back, they moved to Miami. And soon after, my father became involved with this organization called Munir, which was a counter-revolutionary organization. And so he worked closely with the government, the whole group did, not just him specifically, to sort of gather intelligence because of what was happening politically there, right? And so I have still boxes of correspondence at home in Spanish that I would love to slowly translate into English so that I can understand what he was doing. But I do know this. My mother would tell stories that he would leave the house for 6 weeks and he would just be gone. And she would have no idea what was happening if he was traveling back and forth. They were using like shortwave radio, you know, all sorts of things to gather intelligence essentially. So, you know, this kind of politicization of my father, you know, extended until the end of his life. Just conversations were always around politics.
And those time periods you're talking about, your father would go off and your mom wasn't necessarily included to his whereabouts. Was that when they were living in Cuba, or did he continue, or excuse me, Miami, or did that continue when they left the area?
It didn't continue. So once they left Miami, I think he sort of severed all ties with any dreams about defeating Castro, right? I think that fantasy was sort of squelched out, snuffed, gone. And so when they moved away, it was sort of something that was, for him, emotional and incredibly varied. Yeah.
And were these experiences he ever told you about personally, or did you only hear about them from your mother?
Well, I started to ask questions, like, you know, as any curious teenager does. And so I think this leads into, you know, my experience as a first-generation Cuban American, and sort of my inheritance of this kind of politicization and my interest in sort of subcultural movements in the United States, which I think ultimately led to my being an artist. So, yeah, but I started asking questions, and he started telling stories, and those stories to me were, outrageous. Like they're just things that you don't hear about here in daily life. Well, at that time at least, maybe now, I don't know. But like kind of brutal stories about goings on, things he witnessed, things that happened to him when he was traveling back and forth, and how kind of hairy it all got. But you have to understand also, I have an uncle who's passed now, who was a staunch supporter of Castro, a dyed-little communist, and in fact helped militia groups by letting them stay on my grandfather's lavender farms in the provinces. So he was sort of like the naughty brother that didn't buy into the American dream at all. Even when he was here, he referred to all U.S. presidents as Nazis, and up until his death, So I don't know. Really divided and polarized politics in my family.
And I like to express that dichotomy when I talk about Cuba in my Spanish classes in Country of the Day. And whenever I talk about Cuba, I talk about what a polarizing figure Castro was. You have a group of people who left Cuba permanently because they wanted nothing to do with his regime. And then you also get a group of people who were in full support of what he did.
Mm-hmm.
Did your uncle ever give you some of the reasons that he supported Castro?
Sure. I think that he believed in kind of the socialization of necessity. And, I think that he believed that could actually be, instituted on a structural and pragmatic level. I think he really believed this. Now, will we ever see the fruits bear, of these kind of philosophical standpoints? I don't know. But he believed, and so I think it goes into another kind of gray area of poetry, doesn't it? Because then it becomes about belief. And belief is a thing that can take you in many, many different directions, right? Yeah.
So after your grandfather sent your father and his siblings to the United States Defense School, did your grandfather end up moving to the U.S. or did he stay in Cuba?
He stayed in Cuba. He owned land, so this was common for sort of upper middle class, not quite like petty bourgeois, but bourgeois Cuban families, to own land in like St. Augustine, Florida, and then in New York. And he owned land in both places. And he owned a lot of land in Cuba because of his business. So he was the Cuban distributor for Yardley soaps, Yardley's of London, but he also developed perfume. That was like a passion that turned into a business. And so he had lavender fields where he cultivated lavender for his perfumes. And so I think the idea was to expand, like the cigar industry has, for instance, into the States and kind of build these legacy brands. But that never happened because he ended up in prison. He died in prison. My grandfather died in prison, yeah. And they think most likely it was prostate cancer because of the conversations my father had with him over those years. Because of the type of pain that he was having. But he was a dissenter. So, he ended up in prison because he wouldn't just sort of hand over everything that he had built over a lifetime. Right?
So even though your grandfather was in prison, your uncle still remained a staunch Castro supporter. It's a very interesting dichotomy that's in your family.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty common. To my knowledge, the Cuban families I know are pretty common. And there is this sort of kind of weird, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just sort of this blur of beliefs that is part of the kind of Cuban American experience, I think.
And you said earlier that your mother was more instrumental in keeping Cuban culture and traditions alive in your family. I'm curious if there are any holiday traditions that were different in your family than families who don't have Cuban ancestry.
It's quite possible. I think most of them come probably out of the conflation of Santeria with Catholicism. So a lot of these kind of folklorish rituals that are for fun really actually come out of Santeria. So probably, and I think the food too. So if you're making food for Thanksgiving, or if you're making food for a big holiday like Christmas, usually it's kind of revolving around traditional Cuban foods like pork roast and oxtail soup even, and all the food was a big part of it for her, I think. But also weird things like on New Year's Eve, you would, I think a lot of cultures do this thing where you have to eat 12 grapes before midnight. Is that it? Do you know this?
Yeah,
No.
Mexico.
Mexico. So this is, I guess, a Latin, like maybe it came from Spain. I'm not quite sure, because my grandfather did come from Spain to Cuba. And so we would do, that would always be a part of the kind of New Year's ritual. And then another thing was to take a bucket of water and go to every corner of the house and scoop out the spirits from the corners of the house. And then you take it to the front door and you throw the dirty kind of spirit infested water, if you will, out the door. So it was symbolic of kind of cleaning out all the bad, sort of metaphysical goop of the former year and starting fresh, right? So we did that every year, which was unusual. I mean, I don't know anybody else who does that.
Like, which one of your parents implemented that tradition?
I think my mom. I mean, my dad was obviously involved, but she just loved all of that stuff. My mother, you could sort of describe her as an aesthete. Everything like beauty and culture and all of those things were very, very important to her. Literacy and the like. So most of that came from her. Yeah.
I understand that a lot of second generation Hispanic Americans, people who are the children of immigrants, often have this question of identity, of how do I identify myself? How has that question impacted you?
I think it's formulated like my entire identity as a human being in some ways, because you, especially growing up in the South, in the rural South, where I didn't have any sort of sounding board, just sort of gauge identity against, and so I think that. Getting back to like becoming an artist, I think this is where this comes from, because I felt very isolated in some ways as a kid. I knew that my household was different, and people looked at us differently, and they sort of like, we were sort of a thing. We were interesting to people. Whereas for me, it was just kind of a normal state of being, right? So I think that there was that, like feeling a little bit different, and as a result, feeling a little bit isolated. Having not grown up in a large place where you had kind of multiculturalism just saturating the landscape, I just didn't have that. And so, kind of this diversion into daydream and fantasy and poetry, sort of like what I saw. When I saw my uncles or father or their friends talk about Cuba, it was like in this way that wasn't necessarily idealistic, but it was definitely not rooted in actuality, right? So I think that inspired me, that you could sort of transform consciousness or reality based on your own observations, right? And that's what artists do, philosophers.
And have you ever visited Cuba yourself?
No. I mean, this is the thing. Another thing, it's sort of like, I know it's something that I need to do. And I know a lot of Cuban Americans at this point, because I've lived all over the place. I've met many other Cuban American artists that have For instance, a mentor of mine, Ella Troiano, a Cuban-American artist, she's a filmmaker, she made a documentary about La Lupe. And like wrote the liner notes for La Lupe's greatest hits album that came out on Fania, right? This is like the quintessential like salsa label and things. And so I hear all these stories secondhand. And it's always been this way. And part of me wants that to remain sort of precious in a way. Like it's almost like, okay, it's this basis for everything that has stayed in this sort of vacuum that I hold close to me, but at the same time it's something that I haven't demystified by actually going there and tearing down this sort of little kind of fantastical bubble that I've created. So it's a little scary too to think about going and seeing the condition of Cuba and sort of getting to understand the realities of it or actuality there, you know? So yeah, it's in everything that I do, like in the artwork that I do, the people that I collaborate with, my wife, you know, her family, they're from Lebanon, another war-torn place. My other collaborator in my collective, Alfredo Cabezo, is Venezuelan, he's from Caracas, and so he grew up with that. And so it's something that's kind of always on our mind. We're always dealing with issues of identity, we're always dealing with issues of place. And so, yeah, it informs everything that I do.
What are some examples of media, either through literature, through film, through television, that you've consumed that you think might help people understand the Cuban American experience? Are there any works that come to mind?
In what way? Do you mean in a way that paints a picture? That shows
in any
them?
way, either in a way that paints the picture, that shows some of the cultural aspects that you were talking about growing up with, or a way that shows that duality of the Cuban American identity.
Well, for me, this duality gets really heavy, and I can talk about that in a second if you like. But I would say, like, one of the first ways to access a culture and also destroy it is through the food. So maybe that's a point of access, and for me it kind of was the food. And then you can sort of start to build upon that. But also, I would think that, you know, Jose Marti, like reading some of Jose Marti's poetry and beginning to understand why he felt so passionate about this place. For me, cigars have been another thing that have linked me back, and tobacco have linked me back to Cuba. Because there's this thing in Santeria where they actually believe that when they're smoking a cigar, they're communicating with the dead. Like it gets that deep there, cigar smoking for them. And so I do this, like I have a pastime of collecting cigars and researching cigars, and I've learned a lot about the landscape through that interest. And I would say if you're interested in Cuban art, there's a really great book out by a woman named Holly Block. It's called Art Cuba, and it sort of shows you kind of all the way from like sort of indigenous artistic practices all the way up to contemporary Cuban performance art, for instance. So it gets into like Tania Bruguera, who like actually has a school in Manhattan now. I don't know. I mean, for me, it's always kind of culture, right? Is the access point.
When you think about Hispanic Heritage Month, do you know if you were ever aware of it growing up?
No. Yeah, it wasn't anything.
How about now? Is it something that's on your radar, or is it something you don't really think about as much?
No, most definitely on my radar, especially you know, considering like the influx of brown people into the United States over the past few decades. It's hard to ignore anymore, and even my hometown. So when I went to college, I moved from my little South Carolina hometown, and I went to Nashville, Tennessee. And when I came back to visit, like over the course of even like 5 years, all of a sudden, there's this gigantic population of Hispanic people that really changed the city just so much, you know, for the better. Like, so I think, yeah, I think it has to be on everyone's radar at this point because we're in an age where there's this sort of, you know, rectification that's happening between all these kind of borders and stuff, where we're having, you know, sort of having to acknowledge these things. I mean, I know you have a Black Lives Matter talk coming up, right?
Would like to.
We'd like to, and I mean, this is another thing that is hard to ignore.
Dr. Yarbrough, Mr. Albertson, do either of you have any questions for Mr. Prieto?
I think so. Very fascinating.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
But yeah, I really enjoyed doing it. And the only thing I would say is Hegel. As far as that dichotomy goes, right? Like, and thinking, like where it's led me in my research and in my academic career is an interest in Hegel. And more dialectic thinking and less dichotomous thinking. If that helps.
That does, thank you.
Okay.